And we are rolling. Hey, Erin.
Hi, Mark.
So this is Mark Goldberg with the UN and Global Affairs blog UN Dispatch, speaking with Erin Weir of Refugees International. Thanks so much for making the time to chat with me today, Erin. I was thinking that the last time you and I spoke, a few months ago, probably about 6 months ago or more, you had just returned from Somalia. Now, as I understand it, you're off to another holiday destination, which I believe is where?
My colleague and I are heading to southern Sudan.
Excellent. Southern Sudan. So that's actually what we're going to be talking about today, the Sudan. We're also going to be talking about a report that Erin just authored on peacekeeping, which is intricately tied to what's going on in Sudan. And, Sudan is not a place you see in the news, or at least on the front pages, very often these days. But I think for reasons you and I will discuss, chances are in the coming months you will see Sudan make the front pages of a few papers. So I guess with that, I just want to ask you, so where will you be going and what will you be doing in Sudan?
Well, we're heading to Sudan to do an assessment of UNMISS, which is the UN peacekeeping operation that deals with the north-south issues in Sudan. So that's different from UNAMID, which deals with the issues in Darfur. We are going to be visiting Juba, which is the capital of the south, and then a number of smaller provincial capitals and field sites where the peacekeepers are deployed. And we're trying to look at issues of insecurity for civilians and try to predict situations where civilians might reasonably be expected to be unsafe, or where violence is expected to break out over the next few months, in order to make recommendations about what the peacekeepers can do differently or better, and how they can work with local communities to try to keep people safe in the south. Mm-hmm.
So that's like the topic of your report. I was wondering, though, for the uninitiated, could you maybe distill the sort of history of the North-South conflict, in 5 minutes or less, for viewers? Just kind of sort of say what's going on, and then we'll talk about maybe more contemporary issues and what's going on now and what we expect to happen in the future.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm by no means a Sudan expert, but in 5 or 2 minutes or less, basically there was a 21-year civil war between the Northerners and the Southerners in Sudan. The North is largely an Arab population. The South are Black Africans, and there was a lot of underdevelopment, a lot of feeling that the Southerners were being treated as second-class citizens within their own country. And so this led to a protracted and incredibly brutal, vicious civil war that lasted, as I said, over 2 decades. And that was brought to an end in 2005 with the signing of a groundbreaking comprehensive peace agreement, or the CPA. And this was an agreement that laid out conditions for first of all, development in the south, a certain amount of government autonomy. So what you have now is the government of southern Sudan, the president of which is the first vice president of Sudan, of the full country. And it also laid out the terms for a referendum, which takes place in 2011, where the South gets to vote on whether or not they would like to separate from the rest of the country, to vote on independence. So that's the very truncated version. Okay. But as you mentioned, there's expectation that Sudan is going to be in the news, that southern Sudan is going to be in the news in the coming months and years. And that's why this is an incredibly controversial and difficult time for Sudan. And the threat of insecurity and the threat of violence are getting pretty high.
Well, in my understanding, the reason it will be in the news in the coming months in particular is national elections are being held in Sudan, correct?
That's right. In April, there's going to be a national election.
Like the first national elections in Sudan since the takeover of Khartoum by the current sort of military ruling
class,
right. Correct?
Most people, or many people, have never voted in an election. So it's both incredibly logistically difficult and, from a political perspective, from an education perspective, it's a pretty big challenge, and it will be a monumental event, and, hopefully it will go well.
And we expect the elections to proceed freely and fairly, and that the ruling military junta will be kicked out, right?
Well, I mean, I don't know a lot of details about, the the nitty-gritty of the election, so I'll be honest there. But frankly, there's no expectation that the ruling junta will be kicked out, as a matter of fact. So whether or not we think that it will be the result of a free or fair election, I'm not going to comment.
I was sort of being sarcastic. Yes. I guess the other sort of outstanding question, I think, on a lot of people's minds is how does this conflict between the North and South relate to the Darfur conflict, which obviously sort of soaks up much of the attention, or has soaked up much of the attention in the last few years.
Well, I mean, similar grievances underpinned the rebellion in Darfur as did in the South. Again, marginalization and a sense of being treated as second-class citizens. Also, direct attacks by the government of Sudan on the people of Darfur either through their own military or through proxy militias that they were supporting. And you saw similar tactics in the South throughout the course of the conflict between the North and the South. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned earlier, in 2005, the Comprehensive Peace Accord was signed, and I remember at the time, this was a pretty monumental achievement. It ended that a 20-year civil war, killed something like 2 million people, and it was hailed at the time, probably justifiably so, as President Bush's singular foreign policy achievement, his top foreign policy achievement, but my understanding is in the years since that, the sort of CPA, as it is known, has unraveled a little bit, that all of the provisions have not been implemented, and that sort of struggling to keep a lid on the conflict, but is sort of the peacekeeping mission that you mentioned. I was wondering if you can talk maybe a little bit about what that peacekeeping mission is up to, and sort of what you'll be looking for when you visit it.
Yeah, well, first maybe to say, you're right to say that the CPA has unraveled a little bit, and that is also, to a large extent because of the situation in Darfur. This was a massive foreign policy achievement for the Bush administration, absolutely. It took a lot of political investment, and they really pushed for this agreement in conjunction with some other partners. And the problem is that it was, as the name suggests, a comprehensive agreement. It went into the details of border demarcation and sharing of resources, of return and reintegration of civilians, and the division of labor and division of power between government of North and South. A lot of incredibly difficult decisions to implement. And so when the crisis in Darfur started to happen, international attention was completely diverted, and suddenly this massive agreement, this push that had been focused on the South, was refocused on Darfur, and now all the hard work of actually implementing the Comprehensive Peace Agreement didn't happen. There are a lot of really critical steps that have been missed in the process of the implementation of this agreement that make it difficult now to proceed with elections and to proceed with a referendum, even though everyone acknowledges that it's inevitable. These things have to be done. And so UNMISS was deployed in 2005 primarily to support the implementation of the agreement. They were there to provide a certain amount of security, but mainly to provide the civilian expertise to support the CPA, to deal with things like disarmament and reintegration of armed groups of the southern military sort of wing of the former rebels, and manage some of these processes, to deal with the integration of northern and southern fighting forces, to deal with some of the border demarcation issues, and to provide the UN's good offices to support the government of Southern Sudan, this brand new government that formerly had been bush fighters and suddenly had to be administrators, and also to deal with the interaction between the North and the South. So for all of these reasons, the mission was not focused on protection per se. Like I said, it's a small part of their mandate. They do have Chapter 7 authority to use robust action or force to protect civilians under imminent threat of violence. But the fact is the mission was not equipped to be a protection mission. It was equipped to be a classical observation mission to observe and support. And so now they're really struggling with a shift in the situation whereby there's going to be a clear need for civilian protection, but they still don't really have the resources or the guidance to implement that kind of a mandate.
And, I take it there have been sort of so far limited examples of instances in which sort of civilians have come under the threat, and for a variety of reasons, UNMISS was unable, unequipped to sort of protect civilians in an effective way. And this so far has happened, on a somewhat limited basis. But from my understanding of what you're saying is that should this, peace agreement continue to unravel, you might see more instances of violence against civilians. And your concern is that UNMISS, as it is now, is not equipped to deal with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a variety of different kinds of insecurity, and in southern Sudan you see a lot of them now. The first, most basic one is just a lack of law and order. I mean, Sudan is a huge space, and the government, as I said, is new. The government of southern Sudan is a relatively new institution. Their security forces are still being developed, and you also have a number of south-south cleavages, so conflict that doesn't just come between the north and the south, but also between different groups within the south. And so without functioning police and justice systems, those issues, that day-to-day kind of criminality or banditry happens and goes unaddressed. So obviously that's a protection concern. The bigger concerns that we have moving forward are, as you said, the unraveling of the peace agreement, or tensions deriving from the failure to accomplish some of the objectives of the peace agreement. So questions as to, where is north and where is south? Where is that borderline? Fighting over oil in a location, a particular location called Abyei, which is expected to be very contentious and has actually been the site of violence in the past. I can go into that in greater detail in just a moment. But there are a number of places in the south where disagreements founded in the peace agreement, or founded in kind of the failure to properly implement the peace agreement, are expected to crop up, especially around the question of a sovereign south, of an independent south. Now, Abyei is one example of a place where there was a confrontation, a military confrontation between northern and southern forces, and the civilians in town were actually warned that this was coming, or were aware, certainly, that this was coming, and the majority of them had actually fled. They'd evacuated the town before the confrontation happened. But in the aftermath, the international community, including a lot of politicians and humanitarian aid groups, really there was a big outcry against UNMISS for failing to prevent this displacement, for failing to prevent what eventually was the razing of the ground, the razing rather of the town. The whole town was burned to the ground. And the Peacekeepers came back and said, look, we're here in small numbers. We don't have a mandate to put ourselves between a town and a fighting force, or to interpose ourselves between two fighting forces. And we're not here to protect belongings. We're not here to protect people's stuff. So there was this controversy as to what exactly was their role. Should they have prevented this attack from happening, or was it enough that individual civilians weren't hurt? And so, looking forward, as I said, we're hoping to get into some of the contingency planning that UNMISS has done, recognizing that there are expectations on their shoulders for keeping people safe, and also looking at ways that local community sort of self-protection methods, such as fleeing, for one, can be leveraged, so people can be organized and understand what the peacekeepers can do, and then, do whatever is necessary to keep themselves safe and to access peacekeeping resources and humanitarian resources to maintain their security throughout what's probably going to be a pretty difficult time.
I guess it seems like, like you said, UNMISS is in a pretty unenviable position right now, where it's almost like the writing is on the wall that there will be more violence, but yet they, don't have the, as you said, mandate or numbers or equipment to do much to prevent that violence. I guess what, can be done, and who should be doing the action, who should be doing what in order to maybe, is it a matter of increasing sort of the numbers of UNMISS, their equipment, or what countries that their troops come from? Is there anything the Security Council can or should be doing, to make sure that UNMISS is not in this sort of stuck, this kind of helpless position in a way?
Yeah. Well, from the perspective of the Security Council, it's almost too late for them to do what they could potentially have done. Now, the mission does have a mandate to use force to protect civilians under imminent threat, and so that, they do have that authority, officially speaking. That said, the mission is very small. So you have 10,000 soldiers, but most of those are actually not combat soldiers. They're there for force protection and for maintaining the force and civilian staff. If we want to ask the peacekeepers to do real protection, to do robust protection, and to actually be present in all of the places that civilians are going to be at threat, to be able to do the kind of patrolling and monitoring and interaction with civilians and with communities that would be necessary, the forces would need to be much larger. They would need a lot more soldiers, and they would need a lot more clear guidance from the Security Council and from other donor countries and troop-contributing countries that protection is their job. And I mean, that's something that can still be done, but I think expectations need to be managed a bit. And so the perspective of Refugees International is that, without additional forces, without massive numbers of additional forces and additional resources, expectations will have to be far less than what we might ideally want to see the peacekeepers doing. And so I've used the term contingency planning already. I think that's really the key. So identifying locations where you can reasonably expect violence to occur, prioritizing those in the way that we've seen them do in places like Eastern DR Congo, for example, and working out exactly what resources are available, what they can do, and where they can be best deployed in order to maximize their impact. That doesn't mean everyone is going to be protected everywhere, but at least more people will be protected than if they don't go through this sort of exercise. The other side of things, and something that the UN and the mission particularly has already started to do, is to adopt what's called a joint protection team strategy. And this is something that was developed in, again, Eastern DR Congo to try to leverage both civilian and military peacekeeping resources. And so basically, these are teams made up of members of what are called the substantive units of the mission. So, civil affairs, civilian protection, child protection, human rights. People who know things about protection, who know about the different dimensions of protection and can go out with the military and help support them in their development of concrete, localized protection plans, and to help them also interact with the local people. You've got to keep in mind that most of the soldiers in a peacekeeping operation are only deployed for between 6 months and 2 years, and so they don't have time necessarily to absorb the context, to understand the sorts of things they would need to understand to be preventative. And so using the civilian staff who are often there for a longer term and who tend to have greater contextual knowledge of the situation, that helps to create better protection plans. And the final piece of this is obviously the local communities themselves. Peacekeepers can't do it all. And so talking to local leaders, to local civil society groups, and to people who can help sort of rally community members together and work out how best or where best they can be protected is really important. And that's what we're going to encourage UNMISS to do moving forward, and also to look to the Security Council and to political masters in New York, for example, to encourage the mission to do this and to support them both politically and with additional resources, small additional resources if those are necessary.
I guess you and I are both sort of having this conversation with the almost expectation that fighting will break out again. Mm-hmm. And, as you said, the problem is that, the peacekeeping mission there isn't equipped to fully, protect the civilians that might become victims of this fighting. But I wonder, is the sort of outbreak of violence inevitable? I mean, does a renewed fighting between the North and South sort of have to happen? Is the writing seems to be on the wall, but is there anything that can be done to, protect it, to just, prevent that outcome?
Of course, violence is never inevitable. I think, political attention, international political attention has refocused on the South a little bit, which is nice to see, a little too late, but definitely nice to see. And, certainly there are a reemergence of violence will be a political decision, a calculation on the part of political actors and armed actors within Sudan. There are people far more knowledgeable about Sudan and about those political actors than I am, who who may be able to identify motivations or either motivations to fight or motivations potentially, carrots to give people incentive not to fight and to stick with comprehensive peace agreement. And I think it's important for the government of the U.S. and also for other international donors who have been closely involved in this process, really to re-engage in an active way and do both, public and behind-the-scenes advocacy and political pressure to do whatever it is that's possible to prevent a reemergence of large-scale violence. In terms of the day-to-day violence, as I said, the insecurity that comes out of just a basic lack of law and order, that is about security sector reform. And it's a little bit difficult to talk about that in the context of, potential reemergence of large-scale conflict. But nevertheless, international investment in training police, in training judges and lawyers, and getting the justice system back up on its feet, and looking to traditional systems of justice and trying to pull out lessons from that. Working towards law and order and stability within the South will also probably contribute quite significantly to greater stability between the North and the South. And so I think it's important not just to focus, as you said, on the potential outbreak of large-scale war, but actually to look at security and protection in a holistic way and try to come at it at all angles.
I guess, if the fighting happens, it'd be sort of over oil, as you said. It's the South has the oil, but the North has the sort of distribution mechanisms of sort of selling the oil. So I've heard it said that, one way to maybe prevent the outbreak of violence is to sort of intertwine the oil economies of the North and the South so that they're, too dependent on each other to go to war. Does that sort of make sense to you?
It does. It makes sense to me in principle. Definitely. I'm not an economist. I feel like I'm making a lot of excuses here today. But, the fact is, this is already true to a large extent. The oil is in the South, and the infrastructure for the oil is in the North. And I think, for political actors to understand that and maybe not to seek to, undermine that, say, by giving the South the infrastructure to deal with it themselves, something like that. The fact is, at this moment, there is a need for them to interact if they're both going to benefit from the oil. I think one of the problems that you can see is that at the moment, it depends on which side militarily is stronger as well. So, the North, who see not just the economic threat, but also, frankly, the threat in terms of, their own pride, the breakup of the country on their watch. They could see value in attacking and preventing this referendum from happening, or refusing to accept the results of the referendum, ostensibly for national unity, but also for, the convenience of maintaining control of some of these things. And so, that logic makes sense when we're talking about two separate countries. But, until it's two separate countries, I think it's a little bit trickier than that. That said, it's the same sort of system. Anyone who has followed the development of the European Union, it's that same logic. Make it difficult for France and Germany to go to war with each other, make it economically impossible for them to go to war with each other, and they'll have to stop. And I guess you could argue it worked there. So, maybe this is something we could do in Sudan as well.
All right. Well, it's a good note of optimism. Do you want to move on to DRC a little bit? Another
Sure.
area of expertise for you?
Yeah, absolutely.
DRC, for the unaware, is the Democratic Republic of Congo. I don't know if you've noticed, between Somalia and Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo, Erin, you are sort of an expert in sort of some of these sort of hardest places on Earth where some of the most vulnerable people live. I guess, maybe are there any sort of recent developments there that sort of might be, I think we left with a hopeful note on Sudan. Is there anything, any positive trend lines there, or are the trend lines still sort of flat or negative? in DRC?
Well, I mean, to start, again, I would say on a good day, I'm a peacekeeping expert. I'm definitely not a Congo expert, a Somalia expert, or a Sudan expert. I think that's an important distinction to make here. But in DR Congo, I think there are indications both sort of for the better and for the worse, and then some that are worrying, but that we're just sort of keeping an eye on. So as I think you're aware, and some people watching may be aware, there have recently been large-scale operations mounted by the government, mounted by the military in DR Congo, called the FARDC, to root out and sort of eliminate the Hutu militia that with linkages to the former Rwandan genocidaire. So this has been a major bone of contention in eastern Congo since the mid-90s. It's been a source of conflict between Rwanda and DR Congo, and it's something that now the government is really trying to resolve. But the results of a lot of these operations have been massive civilian displacement and a huge amount of insecurity and instability for civilians who have been fleeing their homes and fleeing displacement sites over and over and over again over the course of 10, 15 years. So in that regard, I suppose it's good to see government commitment to resolving some of the issues, but the way they're going about it has really been disastrous from a humanitarian perspective. Also, I spoke earlier of security sector reform in the context of Sudan. This is something that hasn't really happened in any kind of wholesale way in eastern Congo. Over the course of the last 10 years, a number of peace agreements have been signed that incorporate former militia groups into the army, and the most recent, or rather most high profile of those happened just over a year ago, when the one militia group led by the famous General Laurent Nkunda, a group that had been allied with the Rwandans, was actually incorporated into the Congolese military. And so what you have now is forces that had existed previously, or at least ostensibly, to protect Tutsi civilians against the militia that I've just described, the Hutu militia, now incorporated into the army, and these are the units that have been sent after the Hutu militia, sent after the FDLR. And so in the course of looking for this militia group that have always been the enemies of the CNDP, of Laurent Nkunda's group, that this is why you have such massive civilian casualties. You've got attacks directly on civilians who have been accused of collaborating with the militia group, with the Hutu militia. You have direct attacks on civilians just for the sake of looting and villages that have been burned down. So in addition to the actual displacement that's always the result of military action, you have direct attacks on civilians and on villages, and a lot of that can be attributed to these armed groups, this particular armed group that was incorporated without having been trained or vetted at all into the national military, and who are now taking out I don't even know what, just attacking civilians in addition to the people they're supposed to be hunting.
And I guess, how has the peacekeeping mission there been able to respond, or has it, to those attacks on civilians? Has you as I said, specialize in the civilian protection of the protection of civilians by peacekeeping troops. Mm-hmm. Has MONUC, the peacekeeping mission there, sort of been able to do that to a sufficient extent?
Yeah, well, when we were talking about Sudan, I mentioned the Joint Protection Team concept, and this is something that evolved in DR Congo precisely because it's such a complex protection situation. So what they've done, what MONUC has done, in conjunction with the Protection Cluster, which is a group of protection actors that cut across the non-governmental actors, humanitarian actors, other UN groups, sort of brought together to prioritize, where people are most vulnerable, to help the peacekeepers, again, use and deploy scarce resources. And then they've gone out to the fields with these joint protection teams, with civilian actors from various substantive sections of the mission, again, civilian protection, human rights, civil affairs, etc., to identify very localized, very particular security concerns, and to identify very concrete ways that the peacekeepers can respond. And we saw a lot of benefit to that, a lot of improvement, particularly in North Kivu, where the soldiers were having a lot better communication with local people. They were responding much more quickly, and even in places where they weren't able to access the population and provide the kind of security we would want to see, they were, in fact, being well received by the population because there was that sense that there was communication and an effort on the part of the peacekeepers to keep people safe. Another method they've been using is called the Surveillance Center. It's something that was instituted in Kiwanja, where just over a year ago, there was a massive massacre just outside, the doors of the MONUC compound. And at the time, they were unaware that it was happening. There was almost no communication between the peacekeepers and the local people. And now, through cell phone communication networks and this center whereby people can either call in or use MONUC radios to communicate with a translator on the base, there's much better communication and much better response. And so, in a lot of ways, the mission has adapted to the situation that they're dealing with. That said, there are not enough soldiers, there are not enough protection resources in Congo to keep everyone safe. And so, as I said, what you're still seeing is this massive displacement in a lot of areas where the Congolese military have been located.
Can I say it seems to be a recurring theme that there's sort of not enough soldiers and not enough resources. Why, I guess, with all the armies in the world, why, and we know, I have background that most peacekeeping troops come from the developing world. And I think it's fair to say that most developing world countries send want to have their troops as peacekeepers because they're reimbursed for the costs. That's something like $1,100 per month per soldier. So it's actually not very expensive when you think about it, compared to the cost it would be of sending an American soldier to do that. But why? I guess just why aren't there more of a supply, more of peacekeeping troops?
Well, I mean, it really depends on the mission that you're talking about. I mean, in Haiti, for example, they were able to generate additional troops or additional troop commitments at least pretty quickly. In Lebanon, for example, they were able to send the mission extremely quickly. In a lot of cases, it's the same as everything else in politics. Some countries count more or are perceived to count more politically than others. And so, where particular countries and powerful countries with troops available, perceive a mission to be important or a conflict to be important, they're much more inclined to send forces there. And so, as you said, what we see for the most part in a lot of big countries like DR Congo or Southern Sudan, or Chad, well, to a lesser extent in Chad, but I can explain that. These are countries that are kind of off the radar of most people in Western countries and countries with advanced or extremely developed militaries. And so you're less likely to see troops from those countries deployed in these countries, deployed in conflicts like that. But actually, it's not necessarily important to have soldiers from the United States, for example, from Britain, deployed in some of these places. I mean, the bigger question, the bigger concern, particularly with regards to protection, is the fact that there's very little understanding of what protection means, what protection is. When we ask a peacekeeper to protect people, there hasn't been a lot of investigation up until very recently as to what kind of different contexts, what kind of threats, and what kind of response we expect from those peacekeepers. And so, it's one thing to send, an overwhelming number of peacekeepers to a country, but we've not been dealing with protection particularly intelligently. You're not necessarily sending the appropriate troops or the appropriate equipment with the appropriate training to deal with the situations that they're being asked to face. And so, you mentioned a report that just came out. This is what we're talking about, the need to identify exactly what we mean when we're asking peacekeepers to do protection in a place, working out from that what kind of training and what kind of resources they need to do that job, and then really pressuring, not just current troop contributors, but other countries with specialized equipment, specialized capabilities to contribute those in the places where they're most needed.
And so I take it we should, obviously pick up the report and learn more.
Obviously.
We're just at time. Is there anything else you wanted to add, though? I wanted to sort of give you a chance to have those last word for anything you might have left out, or anything else you might want to say.
Well, there's always more to say. I mean, if we're talking about Congo and Sudan, but I think we've probably covered everything we need to today, so thank you for the chance to talk.
So I guess we'll maybe reconnect after your trip, find out sort of what you learned from the ground. Mm-hmm. Presumably there will be another report coming out from your trip, which I always like to read, and which I would encourage anyone who is interested in these issues to check out Erin's work and the work of other great people at Refugees International who are one of those interesting operations that does, they have people on the ground doing field work with sort of very much like a policy orientation, which is always interesting and helpful. So thank you, and we'll talk to you soon.